following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back. San Francisco Giants baseball, past, present, future. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm flying solo today, but I have a guest on the phone. He is an icon in Giants sports documentary history. Is that a good way of doing it? Jon Leon0udakis, returning to the airwaves. Is that a
Hi there, Ralph. It's good to be with you and your audience.
Does that describe you?
Well, I think I refer to myself as a baseball documentarian. I've got 7 films in the permanent collection of the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, and I've got a television show called The Sweet Spot. And we cover a variety of subjects, but I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Giants fan, grew up in the city, ended up going to Game 3 of the '89 World Series earthquake game, and even though I moved out of the city in the mid-'70s, just like Tony Bennett, my heart belongs to San Francisco.
Oh, that's really nice to hear. I was standing on a porch in Oakland, California, the day of the earthquake, waiting for the game on the radio. And all of a sudden, we were all shook up. You were there, you filmed it, you documented it. I want to know, this has been on my mind since the last time we spoke. You just happened to have your camera with you that day, and it wasn't just a little brownie, it was a large camera.
Yeah, I had a couple of cameras with me. Of course, this was my very first World Series game. And not only that, my team was in it. And I was lucky enough to get a ticket. My brother Tim took me. So you bet, this is a momentous occasion. I'm going to take pictures. I had my still camera, my Canon SLR. I had about 5 rolls of film, and I borrowed my dad's VHS camcorder, which was the size of a small howitzer that you put on your shoulder. And I got to the ballpark. We got there early. We started interviewing people in the ballpark, outside, I should say, in the parking lot. And it started capturing the color and the festivities of it with all the various vendors and the celebratory bric-a-brac that sort of festoons the ballpark and sort of decorates and dots the parking lot as you make your way into the stadium. And that's what I was there for, which was, the glory and the color of experiencing your very first World Series. And then, of course, at 5:04 p.m., the story took a huge left turn.
Absolutely. It was your first World Series because you're a West Coast fellow, growing up as a Giant fan. But it was from 1962 to 1989 before they got into the World Series. How old were you in 1962?
I was 4, and I really didn't become sentient about baseball until a couple of years later.
Okay. And there was a tremendous amount of frustration in those years for Giant fans because they had a terrific team through the 60s with Bobby Bonds and Willie and all that went with it, and they always came up short to the Dodgers. It was a matter of pitching. And,
you're right, and how everybody wonders, how do you lose with Mays, McCovey, Jim Ray Hart, Orlando Cepeda, Juan Marichal, Gaylord Perry, Frank Lindsay, all these terrific players, but the Dodgers just seem to have a little bit better pitching than the Giants did, except for, of course, 1962. But after that, I think you're right, Ralph, there were 2 or 3 years where the Giants came in second, a game behind or a game and a half back of the Dodgers.
Very frustrating. And I got to tip my hat to the Dodgers, though. They did it with all pitching, and ironically, the 2 teams were so different Dodgers had pitching, very little hitting. Giants had all kinds of hitting and very little pitching beyond Marichal, Perry. They just didn't. Not that Billy O'Dell and those guys weren't really good. They just came up short to the Dodgers. I'll give them credit in every way.
Tough to beat the duo of Koufax and Drysdale. And don't forget the Dodgers had terrific team speed with Willie Davis, Tommy Davis, and, of course, Maury Wills. The Giants didn't have that component. So, it's a chess game, and we've heard that axiom that good pitching beats good hitting. And I think the Giants ran into that. I also think the Giants did not have the managerial wisdom to match Walt Alston after Alvin Dark was sent packing. I don't think Herman Franks was a particularly strong strategist. I don't think that helped the Giants' cause either. And, of course, trading away Orlando Cepeda was an unforgivable sin.
Well, you mentioned the Swamp Rat. He was nicknamed Alvin Dark because he was a terrific strategist. He played the ballpark. He played the infield with the groundskeepers. He was very, very bright. He was a complicated human being, to say the least.
That's a nice way of saying his racist background got in the way of his brilliance as a field manager. People forget his time managing the Giants. That was his first time as a manager after he retired as a player, and he was terrific. Coming from Louisiana, he could not reconcile working with players of color and treating them equally. So much so that he essentially segregated the clubhouse with the Latins, the blacks with the blacks, and the whites with the whites. And his demise came. Horace Stoneham continued to warn him. Stoneham was very progressive and liked getting players from the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, so on and so forth. He'd been warned on several occasions. And he finally, went too far, and that's what got him canned. He could not get along with players of color, which was a shame. But before he died, Orlando Cepeda mentioned to me when I interviewed him a couple of years ago, he said, Alvin Dark apologized to me and said, the way he had been back then was wrong, and he had since learned that he was wrong and didn't want to be that way anymore.
Well, that's nice. But Alvin Dark had plenty of time to change. He was the shortstop of the Giants in the early 50s when Willie was called up. And Hank Thompson was on that team. And
Monty Irvin.
And Monty Irvin on that team. He was the captain of that team. Wow. That's why I say a complicated human being.
Yeah, as so many of them are. And Arnold Hano mentioned to me last week that Willie Mays is the last living member of that 1954 New York Giants team from the went to the World Series and won.
No, he's the last living member of the 51 team.
Oh, is it 51?
Yes.
Okay.
As far as 54, there are a few others.
I'm glad to hear there are more with us.
Yes. I'll check that. I would really trust Arnold right off the bat rather than me, but I'll check that. I'm almost sure. I know he's the last surviving member of 51, and I'm pretty convinced that there are others. Thank you once again, belatedly, and I've thanked you before for bringing Arnold onto these airwaves. What a thrill it was for me, because I was a kid that grew up worshiping that book, worshiping the day that Willie made the catch, and the way he wrote it, A Day in the Bleachers. You're blessed to have him as a close friend.
You're right about that. And he's 96. He's doing great. We talked last week. I took a couple of pieces of writing, beautiful writing that he did for Sport magazine, and I've included it on our Sweet Spot Baseball channel, and it's one of them specifically focuses on the Giants in 1962, Game 7 of the 62 World Series, which the Giants would lose in a heartbreaker 1-0 to the Yankees. But Hano had a unique assignment. Sport Magazine said, you're going to cover the losing clubhouse of every game of the 62 World Series, Game 1 through 7. And naturally, that generated a certain amount of resentment from some of the players. But there's a piece he wrote for Sport Magazine called Tension and Torment, and it is essentially a portrait of Jack Sanford, who was a losing pitcher, starting pitcher for the Giants in Game 7 of the 62 World Series. And, of course, the one run that scored in that game came in the middle of as a result of a double play, and that was it. But he basically he's with Sanford in the clubhouse as the game comes to an end, and basically writes about it's a portrait of a beautiful loser. And it's some of the most poignant sports writing you will ever read. And it's a little 2-minute film clip, and folks can watch it now on our Sweet Spot channel on Vimeo on demand.
I will look for that for two reasons. Your reason, and that I have Jack Sanford's baseball warm-up jacket hanging in my closet.
Wow, that's an incredible artifact. How did you come by that?
Well, I came by that in a most pleasant way. My godfather in radio, Tony, and I'm not even going to mention him his name on the air in regard to this, because he gave this jacket to me that his late brother wore when he was a scout for the Giants, and he got it from Jack Sanford.
Wow.
So I'm happy to have it. And, it's a bit tattered, but what a memento, and what a coincidence that you bring up that name. He was one of the solid pitchers for the Giants in '62.
Well, some of the fans who don't go as far back as you and I, Ralph, don't realize how good he was. He won 24 games one year. He was also the Rookie of the Year for the Phillies in 1955. He was an outstanding pitcher. And a real old-school guy. When I interviewed Mike Murphy for our series, we talked a little bit about Jack Sanford and what he went through losing that 7th game. And, everybody had a lot of respect for Jack Sanford, as well as Billy Pierce, who I don't think lost a home game pitching for the Giants in '62, which included the World Series, unless I'm wrong.
I don't think so. What was he, 19-1 that year or something like that?
He had a remarkable record, and that was a really astute pickup. And a terrific.
Solid he was in his career. There are some folks that think he should be a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, he was one heck of a pitcher, and everybody said he was a really nice guy too.
Yeah. As we talk, I'm racking my brains for survivors of the '54 World Series, and I want it to come to me. I don't want to go Google see who survived. That's a little game I play. I only Google when I can't come up with it. It's like losing a game of solitaire to yourself. Let's talk about Willie McCovey. Since we talked, last talk, Willie passed away, and I want to know what he meant to you as one of your heroes.
Well, I was born and raised in San Francisco. I was born in '58. So those Giants teams of the '60s, the ones I recall best, started in '64. And all us kids, when we grew up on my block, we loved playing baseball. We loved pretending we were Willie Mays or Willie McCovey or Juan Marichal. But in my mind, if Willie Mays is the heart of the San Francisco Giants, Willie McCovey is and always will be the soul of the San Francisco Giants.
No question about that. That's how every Giant fan feels. He's beloved. Willie was they took to Willie. It took them a long time. Let's just say that, Giants fans, to realize what they had in Willie. He came from New York, and
McCovey?
right about the time that the new breed was coming up, Orlando, and then Willie and Willie McCovey. So would you describe how that took place a little bit, how it took place in the fans' minds?
Sure. Well, Willie Mays came west with the Giants from New York, and I believe it was in 58 or so, or actually in 59 when Orlando Cepeda started coming up and joining the team. He did not start with the New York Giants. He made his way up to San Francisco and, of course, was a smash in his rookie season. And San Franciscans seemed to really take to Orlando Cepeda as one of their own. Of course, he had this very friendly, lovable personality, and, of course, he was an incredible hitter. And Mays was, for some reason, seen as, the outsider, the guy that came over from New York. And, it's hard to know, how much racism was mixed in with that, because Mays fought a certain amount of racism during his time in San Francisco, particularly in the early 1960s.
He couldn't buy a house in the best neighborhoods. He literally was redlined from buying
There were struggles with that. So
San Francisco was a very racist city at one time.
It was. It was very subtle.
Last Thursday, as a matter of fact.
What's that?
No, I'm only kidding.
Okay. So Cepeda was huge when he got going in San Francisco, and then Willie McCovey came up in 59, but because the two of them were first basemen, it was really tough for management to figure out where are you going to play these guys and where are you going to play McCovey, because Cepeda had begun establishing himself as a slugger. And of course, Bill White was with the team at the time, so they really had kind of a logjam there. And McCovey kind of went up and down, even though he had this incredible, auspicious beginning. People forget that in 59, he won the Rookie of the Year award. He didn't even get on the team in the bigs until July the 30th.
Right.
What did he do? He hit in his first 7 games. He got hits in his first 7 games, hit 476, and then in the middle of August had a 22-game hitting streak, at the end of which he was hitting 381. And so 2 months, hit 354 with 13 homers, on-base percentage of 429. And it's just an astonishing 656 slugging. So the guy misses more than half the season and ends up getting Rookie of the Year. But it took him a few years to put it all together and for the Giants to find a place for him. But by, I think, 63 was his first big breakout season.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that when he first came up, people don't remember how fast he was. He had these long strides, loping strides, and he can go from first to third faster than almost anybody in baseball. He and Cepeda both hurt their knees, and it ruined their careers. And it didn't ruin them, obviously, but it really curtailed their careers. They were both lousy in left field. No question about that.
And I think both of those guys would tell you that was not their natural positions, and they were doing their best to help the team. They tried Cepeda at third base, they tried him in the outfield, but both of those fellas they felt most comfortable at first base. And you're right, their knees were very problematic for them. As a matter of fact, Orlando said his knee problems began even before he started playing professional baseball. He hurt his knee one day playing basketball. And he was terrified. He didn't want to tell his father because his father was going to be very upset with him. But it's right. You're right. Those injuries really dogged those fellows through their careers. But both, look at McCovey. He played, 22 seasons?
Right. No question. For a while, there was Mike Ivey. I don't know if you remember that.
I remember him.
They dealt McCovey, and I think Ivy always got a bum rap. He replaced McCovey, which was incredibly difficult to do, and he put up some good numbers. He wasn't a bust, but it was great to get Willie back too. That was a big moment in Giant history.
Well, don't forget that the reason the Giants dumped the salaries of Mays and McCovey is because they were losing money. And so the big ticketed players were being cast off reluctantly, of course. So Willie, made his way back to the Giants. And yes, Mike Ivy was a terrific power hitting player. He had an unfortunate part of his career where I think he struggled emotionally. But he was one heck of a hitter. But you never replace a hitter like Willie McCovey, one of the greatest slugging left-handed hitters in the history of baseball.
Right. Very good. The fans didn't take to him because of that. Fans are fickle. You can understand that. But McCovey coming back was great. Rest in peace, Willie Mack. How about that? He suffered a long time with his knee injury, became chronic, and ended up with many surgeries. Somebody told me he had 12 surgeries on each of his knees, 12
oh, wow.
each. And he went from this terrific athlete. When your body fails as an athlete, a lot of your ego goes with it. And McCovey never changed. He always had the terrific disposition. He had the smile, which was infectious. He would greet people with a positive nature. And he suffered a couple of knee transplants, went bad, had to do them again. And if anybody's had a relative that's gone through that once, you've heard stories of how tough it is. I'm really going to miss Willie McCovey. There aren't many players that just come to mind automatically when you say baseball.
He's certainly one of them. I want to share with you some personal stories, some people I know who had actual contact with him. One of them was one of my classmates in the 1960s. People forget that in the 60s, baseball players weren't paid a lot, and a lot of the players needed to have off-season jobs. One night she came downstairs and found Willie McCovey and another man in their living room selling insurance to her parents.
Oh, wow.
And then a friend of mine, this was probably, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, gal, she had a flat tire on the Bay Bridge. And if you've ever had a flat tire on the Bay Bridge, it's a pretty scary proposition. Absolutely. In any case, she said his black Mercedes-Benz rolled up behind her while she was waiting for some help to arrive. And it was Willie McCovey and his driver. And he asked her, do you need any help? We'd be happy to help you. So that just gives you an idea of what kind of person he was.
Just a stranger in the night.
Yeah.
I mean, wow. That's a great story. That will stick in my mind because I never had personal contact with the man, but I observed him as, from the outside, as a Giant apologist when they got to San Francisco. I was heartbroken when they left New York. But you know what's interesting? When they won the pennant in '62, Dark was managing. Their entire coaching staff was made up of former New York Giant players. Wes Westrom, Larry Jansen was the pitching coach. I can't think of the other coach, but that brought the connect back to me. I was still in New York, and they were gone, and I remember that.
Don't forget, Bill Rigney was part of the team too, wasn't he?
Right. He was the last Giant to manage last manager to manage in New York, and the first one to manage in San Francisco. And ironically, Rigney lived in Alameda, California, where I make my home and have for the last 25 years. And I've got some great stories about Alameda baseball. But this isn't the day for it. They called him Cricket, Bill Rigney. And he was a bench jockey.
Oh, yeah. He has a big needle from the bench, that's for sure.
Right, as a utility infielder with the Giants. And it is said that he was insulting the Dodgers so much that somebody ended up running into Davey Williams.
Yes, that was Jackie Robinson.
Was that Jackie? And I think it was a result of the Crickets bench jockeying. I can't...
I can't remember if I'm remembering the story right, he didn't like getting brushed back by Sal Magley. So the idea was that he was going to lay down a bunt down the line and he was going to blast Magley into the next county. But it didn't unfold that way on the bunt. And Davey Williams ended up covering first, and he ended up getting smashed into right field, unfortunately.
And basically, I think his back went out, and he was never the same. But
Rigney said of McCovey, he said he has a near-perfect swing and doesn't go after too many bad balls. And when I interviewed Mike Murphy, the longtime Giants clubhouse man for over 50 years, he had a great McCovey and Rigney story when Rigney was the manager. He said, "Hey, Murph, we got a new guy coming in tomorrow. I want you to get ready for him. Big Irishman. Big Irish kid. You're going to love him. He's 6'4", 200 pounds. And next day, Murphy said, he turned around, and there was this big Irishman, Willie McCovey.
That's beautiful. That is a great story. So his name on the back, O. McCovey. That great story.
And McCovey, like so many of the other Giants who played in that 62 World Series, in that seventh game, Felipe Alou and Willie Mays, they were all just haunted and tormented by that ninth inning of the seventh game of that World Series. There were a lot of things that went sideways for the Giants in that game, but that last inning, I talked to Felipe Alou earlier this year. He said, my brother Matty was on first base when Willie Mays hit that double, but because of the rain, the water, the ball moved very slowly, and Roger Maris was able to get to it quickly, and we had to stop, the third base coach had to stop Matty from trying to score from third base, but he was a very small guy, so on and so forth. He said, I'm a lot bigger, and Willie Mays has said the same thing, in that he said, I would have run through the coach's sign, and the collision at home plate would have been enormous. Mays and Alou said, I would have put Elston Howard into the parking lot.
Wow. I heard that Mays had said simply, I'd have taken the plate. But I never heard Alou's comment about that, and that's something from my memory bank.
Felipe said he had 99 RBIs that year, never been asked to bunt, and in that last inning, Alvin Dark asked him to bunt, and he ended up striking out. And he said that because that really confused me why he wanted me to bunt after I'd been hitting the ball so well. And he said, that game just haunts me. It torments me.
Well, and you wonder if that had anything to do with his underlying craziness about how he saw people. For instance, he had this rating system, and it was a year that Cepeda hit like 125 ribbies.
Mm-hmm.
And the rating system tore down Cepeda's worth, and it was ridiculous. And I wonder if he saw Latin players as just not being capable of delivering in the clutch.
Well, there was an infamous quote of Alvin Dark's. I know, but the gist of it was that he basically said that players of color, aren't as good as white players, which was, of course, nonsense. And, and he tried to institute a program where English was only spoken, it was the only language to be spoken. And Cepeda told him, that's not going to fly. That this is my native language. I've got my brothers on my team, Felipe Alou. It's an insult. I won't do it.
Listen, you had so many Latin. You had 5 or 6 Latins on that team.
Yeah.
You had Pagan,
Mm-hmm.
Manny Moda was on that team. A lot of people forget he came up as a Giant.
That's right. And then he had his brothers, Jesus and Mateo.
Right. Jesus came a little later, but they were the first 3 brothers to play in one outfield in baseball.
That's right.
I don't know if they started the game. I tend to think that they didn't, Willie Mays being the center fielder of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But they did spend time in the same outfield, which is an absolute... And the 4th brother, Babaloo. Well, if you have a musical history...
There you go. That's right.
All right. So, Joe, tell me what your next project is, what you're working on, so we can refer to that when next you return.
Sure. Earlier this year, I published my first baseball book. It's called Baseball Pioneers. It's available on Amazon.com. And what makes this book unique, Ralph, is that 4 of the 6 pioneers in this book are women. We've got 2 women from the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, also known as a league of their own, that played from 1943 to 54. We've got a woman who's been a professional umpire for almost 40 years, and Justine Siegel, who was the first woman to be hired by a major league team as a coach, and she was a pitching coach for the Oakland A's fall ball team in 2015. And the other pioneers we mentioned in the book, we have Jackie Robinson and the great Jim Mudcat Grant. So that book came out earlier this year. It's available now on Amazon, and it's a companion piece to my television series, which is The Sweet Spot, a treasury of baseball stories. And I've just expanded our channel that's on Vimeo on demand. Ralph, we've got 7 hours of content. We've got the terrific film on Arnold Hano called Hano, A Century in the Bleachers. And we also have the full feature film I made about my experience at the 1989 World Series, which is called The Day the World Series Stopped. And then we have 3 seasons of content from The Sweet Spot. And your listeners can find that at vimeo.com/on-demand/The Sweet Spot. It's just $2.99 a month. You can quit out at any time. There's no obligation. And that $2.99 a month is all you can eat. You can watch it on your mobile device, on your smart TV at home, or on your computer.
Wow. Hey, I got to ask you about Mudcat Grant. We've had him on these airwaves as a guest. An absolutely charming man with no bitterness and stories to tell that are terrific. I can't wait to watch that.
We've got a few episodes that are just, you won't believe them, Ralph. There's one where he has breakfast with John F. Kennedy. He gets a surprise call from the Secret Service when he's on the road in 61 in Detroit, and ends up getting invited to have breakfast with JFK because JFK wanted his thoughts on the racial issues in the United States. And he is an American treasure. Mudcat grew up in the Jim Crow South in the 40s and faced a lot of racism during his time as a major leaguer. Of course, Larry Doby was his roommate when he pitched for Cleveland. But you're right, he's one of the sweetest men you will ever meet, and a great baseball player, a terrific pitcher. And the first African-American to win 20 games in the American League. And I also believe the first African-American starting pitcher to homer in a World Series.
Wow, that's a piece of trivia for you, I'll tell you that. You mentioned prejudice that Mudcat put up with. I think there was a story, if my memory serves, his pitching coach, bullpen coach, there was an instance with that.
There was. This was in 1960. I believe it was in Cleveland. They were facing the Yankees. It was on a weekend. Mudcat said the place was packed. And Mudcat was really starting to feel getting angry about the treatment of African Americans at that point. And so when the anthem was played, he changed the words to it at some point where he said, "And this land is not so free because I can't go to Mississippi and sit at the counter."
Singing in, right.
And the pitching coach, who was from Texas, said, "Well, if you don't like our country, why don't you get the hell out?" He said, and he knew this guy was from Texas. He says, "Well," he goes, "why don't you move to Russia?" He says, I don't need to move to Russia. I'll just move to Texas because Texas is worse than Russia." And Mudcat said, with that, he said, fists started flying, and it was on. So when you talk about national anthems and protests, he did it 50 years before Colin Kaepernick. And this was somebody who was a righteous person, was raised in the Baptist faith, very strong religious guy, but he wasn't going to tolerate that sort of nonsense.
It was horrible and it was nonsense, but I must remind you that Colin Kaepernick is not protesting, never has protested the national anthem, which is a war song, but that's another story. Colin Kaepernick is protesting the way blacks are treated by society. I don't know if it was the shootings or what have you, but it wasn't a matter of protesting the national anthem.
And I think it's a misnomer because, with respect to Mudcat, because he was protesting the treatment of African Americans in the United States at the time. It was not really directed at the anthem per se. I mischaracterized that. That's my fault.
Okay. Let me just tell you my catfish story. He was traded from Cleveland to Minnesota.
Yes.
In the middle of a doubleheader. So, first game, he's pitching he's on Cleveland. Second game, he's got to take all his stuff and walk across the field. And if it wasn't that, they told him when he came in that he's pitching for Minnesota. The first guy to greet him is Harmon Killebrew.
Wow.
And he talked on an interview that I was lucky enough to give him, or he give me, however it is. See, I'm not only have short-term memory loss, I have short-term memory loss. But Killebrew was absolutely colorblind. That's basically what he said. That's something, when you think of great sluggers, people could remember that story. It was very poignant to me.
Well, we've got a 40-minute episode of Mudcat talking about racism in the pro game that he experienced. It's called Baseball on the Inside Corner. And he told a story that I was absolutely shocked. I mean, I had heard that there were some managers who said, there will never be a black 20-game winner on my team. But the one thing I had never heard that Mudcat told me about was he said there were some catchers, not all, some of the white catchers who sabotaged him because they didn't want to see a black player do well, their own teammate. And Mudcat said that didn't just happen to me. He said that happened to a number of guys. And that I found shocking because they're all out there trying to win a baseball game, but some of them would sandbag their own teammate who was pitching and jeopardize their team winning or losing a game due to racism.
Does that make one want to cry for humanity or what?
Yeah. It is absolutely shameful. But he told a wonderful story. Jim Perry, who was also a Cy Young winner, and the brother of Gaylord Perry. Now, both of those fellows were raised in the South. And Mudcat said, I think, near the latter part of his career, or when he was finishing up, I should say, his time with the Twins, he said he got a phone call at the hotel from Jim Perry. And he said, would you come up to my room? I want to talk to you about something, because they were teammates. And Mudcat said that Jim Perry told him, he said, you know, I want you to know the way that I used to be, which is someone who was prejudiced from the South. He said, I'm not going to be that person anymore. And Mudcat felt that that was, you know, a great thing to hear, and he felt that part of it was that he saw how Mudcat treated people. As you say, he was colorblind when you talk about Harmon Killebrew. That Mudcat was a loving, peaceful person to everybody he came in contact with. And I think that might have gotten through to somebody like Jim Perry. And Mudcat said, what a wonderful thing to hear that from somebody who had come from a background where he was raised with that sort of prejudice, but he was mature enough to be able to shake it off.
Wow. John, if you could remember to send me a link to that show, send it to me on Facebook, and I'll post it on the website, on the company.
Sure, absolutely.
That would.
And I got to leave you with one really funny story about Mudcat. This was from Jay Johnstone, the well-traveled ball player in the 60s
yes.
and 70s. He
and
said
an author
that
himself, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe they wrote about him. Go ahead.
Yeah, he said that Joe Askew, the catcher, was going out to Mudcat Grant in the middle of the game and sort of patting him on the chest repeatedly and going back in, going back out. And after a while, the umpire said, can you hang on? The umpire said, what's going on out there? He said, well, I'm just here firing the guy up. I'm getting him fired up. And what was really happening was that Mudcat had embedded the laundry detergent Tide into his jersey to get a little bit better grip on the ball. And it was a hot day, and he was perspiring. And so what was happening was bubbles were coming up from the detergent. And, of course, that's a foreign substance. That's not allowed. And Mudcat got a good chuckle out of that when I mentioned it to him, that Jay had shared that story with me.
I can't wait to see that episode.
Well, I'll make sure you get it, and please share it with your listeners, and it's going to be a wonderful, enjoyable thing.
Beautiful. Thank you, John. You're a terrific guest. Don't make it so long this time. Come back sooner.
It's my pleasure, Ralph. Thanks very much, and I'll make sure you get that information.
Thank you, my friend. The show is San Francisco Giants baseball, past, present, future. And we're talking on the Zone Radio Network. I'm Ralph Tycho. I'm blessed to have Jon Leon0udakis as a guest. We'll be back soon. Keep watching. Keep listening. Adios.
Thanks, Ralph. Take care.
The proceeding was a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Thank you for listening.